We've heard of disaster weddings, but have you ever attended a disaster funeral? What happened? My great-grandmother's funeral, when the coffin was in the ground, before the grave was filled, obviously, family members each threw a rose on top of the coffin. My obese step-grandmother lost her balance and fell into the grave. Very comical. I hope her name was Rose. Not me, but I used to work for a funeral director because I was considering going to mortuary school. He told me about a funeral where a guy busted into the cathedral and threatened the entire funeral party with a handgun. He'd robbed the gas station down the street and the cops were after him, so naturally he thought he'd hide in a funeral. Anyway, turns out the cops were closer on his tail than he imagined, because they rolled in right after him. They ended up chasing him to the parish hall and tased his butt in front of the whole funeral congregation. My grandfather died. The funeral was a solemn affair, as these things usually are. My grandmother, naturally, was distraught. They'd married during the war. He'd been captured and sent to a POW camp. They then spent over 50 blissful years together. We were chatting about my grandfather with her, laughing, crying, reminiscing, when entirely out of the blue she said, "One thing I won't miss is sleeping next to him. He always rolled over and nearly pushed me out of bed." A few years later she died as well. It's hard to carry on when the life you knew for half a century has been ripped apart. As per her wishes, she was to be buried next to her husband. We dutifully trudged down to the cemetery, held a small ceremony, and escorted her body to the grave. The double headstone had already been half filled with my grandfather's details. Underneath the blank half, a 6-foot deep hole lay waiting. We slowly lowered my grandmother's coffin in. It didn't fit. There wasn't enough room in the grave for the bloody coffin. Despite being dug on the correct side of the grave, somehow my grandfather's coffin had conspired to shift under the earth and encroached on my grandmother's side. The mourning party excused ourselves from the graveside while adjustments were made, all of us giggling about how granddad had rolled over in his sleep again. Well, it was preferable to thinking the gravediggers were too stupid to dig a correctly sized hole in the ground. That's the cutest story I've ever heard that required 2 people to die. We thought we were gonna lose my grandfather at my grandmother's memorial service. Too much standing in hot weather and he collapsed and lost consciousness. My nurse aunt was on the scene, though. Happy to say that was 8 years ago and he's still alive and reasonably well. My grandma had a heart attack at my aunt, her daughter, funeral. My brother was working for a funeral home. He was handing out yarmulkes at the door of the event room where a Jewish funeral was being held when there was a heck of a commotion inside. Screaming, yelling, furniture falling over. The door slam open and a bunch of guys drag the rabbi out into the parking lot and beat the crap out of him while people run around screaming and freaking out, and my brother just stands there paralyzed with a stack of paper beans clutched in his hands. Turns out it was the wrong body in the box. Aside from the usual concerns about where the heck dear departed Uncle Ira is, this also means that the rabbi didn't sit with the body like he was supposed to, which is a big deal to observant Jews. Cops were called. Various people were hauled away. Uncle Ira was located. The funeral home and the rabbi were sued. No idea what happened to any of them because my brother quit a month later. That's a pretty amazing story, actually. Not really a disaster but pretty funny nonetheless. My grandpa throughout his life attended many funerals. In every, no exaggeration, funeral procession, I think it's called, where everyone drives their cars in a line from the funeral home to the graveyard, that he drove in, he would get hit by another car. Usually it happened while crossing the intersection during a red light since funeral processions can't run them. Nevertheless, it always happened. It was always minor and nobody got hurt. Fast forward to his own funeral. He is in the hearse on his way to be buried and the freaking hearse gets hit. No joke. This sounds like he pee off the wrong witch or whatever and they put a really crappy curse on him. And in every funeral procession you're in, may your car get hit by another one. I went to the funeral of a good friend a month ago. In his 70 years he'd moved a long way from the aristocratic competitive English family he was born into. Partly due to a bout of mental illness, partly due to his gentle and competitive personality, he'd ended up working with homeless people in Toronto rather than pursuing a high-paying career. During the whole service, which was run by his two brothers, they insulted him at every turn, still looking down on him for not being as rich and successful as they were. I eventually stepped in and asked to speak, just so someone would say positive things about him. Thank you for stepping up. Oh my god, it is my time to shine. So, I'm a bagpiper for hire. I play a lot of funerals, since I guess that's just when people want to hear me play. Not that I'm complaining. It's hot and sweaty, but it's a reasonable side job. Anyway, I lived in North Idaho at the time, so think hick country. The dad had died, committed suicide. Very tragic. I didn't want to press questions, but partway through the service, I hear voices raising, like shouting and swearing in the back of the group of people. Well, I usually stand a ways away from the actual burial for respect reasons, but I had to find out what was up. Lucky for my curiosity, I didn't have to get any closer because angry words turned into angrier fists. Turns out the brother and son of the man we fighting over who would get the apparently rare gun the man had killed himself with. They didn't even have the gun. They were fighting over who would get a gun that hadn't even been returned to the family. I wasn't there because I didn't know him, but my granddad was carried to his funeral in what was essentially a cardboard box by his biker friends. On the motorway his arm popped out of the box. Kinda sad because they honestly might have been doing their best to honor their friend. Crap happens. My grandfather died of injuries that he sustained in World War II. He had actually returned home and survived for 2 years but died of recurring infections that he got from shrapnel in his belly. When he returned home, he and my grandmother just could not get along at all for lots of reasons and ended up divorcing. A few months before his death he remarried a woman in the next town over. My grandmother never got over my grandfather and had basically always assumed that they would get back together. She treated this woman as a non-entity. At the funeral there was a huge fight between my grandmother and this woman because my grandmother claimed she had no right to be there because she did not have children with him and should respect his children by leaving. As you can imagine, the woman did not leave and it was very awkward and uncomfortable for all in attendance. At my great aunt's funeral the priest looked about 5 minutes from death himself and repeatedly said he instead of she when referring to my aunt. My nana was one of 9 siblings. She was originally from England and that's where her siblings lived, but she lived in Australia. When she passed, none of her siblings were healthy enough to make the near day-long flight down under, so they each organized for flowers to be sent to the funeral service. Except that they all got sent to the wrong funeral home, and my nana's funeral was very bare. Sad considering that her pride and joy was gardening. My uncles wiped all the desserts for after the funeral. Caused a bit of drama. Like, yeah, Merrill just died, but where are the cookies? You don't often hear of people named Merrill these days. I was a guest at a funeral for a high school friend's stepdad. Or was it actual dad? Even I forget, which is part of the story. Someone, a friend of the family, I think, got up to give a short speech, and it sounds like he was coming from the heart. In the middle of him talking he said something that caused a member of the departed's family to jump up and yell, "That's not him." The person speaking thought they were saying that he was depicting the departed incorrectly, so he said to them, "I'm sorry, he's gone. I'm just speaking how I remember him as a close friend," or something similar. Then the person who had yelled screamed, "You are talking about her husband," or similar. Turns out the guy had the father and stepfather mixed up and thought that the wrong one was dead. He started trying to recover and then just walked off the stage and out of the chapel. Then nobody wanted to get up and speak, so the priest official whatever got up and said some generic words and the family stayed as everyone else left. It was super awkward. I felt really bad for my friend, but also really glad I was an outside observer guest and not related to any of the people there. I wouldn't call it a disaster, but my mom's burial was a bit of a train wreck. Basically, her side of the family is a tribe of emotionally unstable, rude, and selfish individuals who lie and cheat their way through life. My mom was no exception, but she was my mom, you know? Anyway, when she died, they refused to pay for any of her funeral. They were content with paying for a cremation and sharing her cremains. WTF. My dad said no freaking way and we had a proper funeral burial. BTW, they were never married. When it came time to lower her ashes into the plot, my 90 years old grandma picked her ashes up off of the lowering deck and tried to run away with them and began shaking her urn up and down while screaming. This is at a freaking cemetery. It took 4 family members to get the urn out of her hands and put it back down so the service could continue. Thankfully, her cremains were in a sealed bag, because she definitely would have spilled. This was supposed to be a mournful moment and my grandma turned it into something about her. It was the worst. They then came to the luncheon after the burial and acted like nothing happened. They still have never contributed a dime to her funeral costs, yet were enraged that I didn't invite them to my wedding. I don't speak to any of them anymore. Good riddance. There was a steep flight of numerous granite steps, in 3 large sections, leading from the sidewalk to the main front doors of the church. During the funeral service, it started sleeting and icing up outside. Afterwards, as the pallbearers struggled to carry the coffin down to the hearse, a few lost their footing on the ice and the coffin crashed to the steps, careening down to the sidewalk below. Somehow the lid never opened, but the bottom of the coffin split partly open. The funeral directors had to use straps to secure it and hoist it in one piece into the hearse. Even though those attending were mortified by what they witnessed, some recalled at the reception thereafter that the deceased had a great sense of humor and probably would have found something appropriate to say to make light of it. This was an almost disaster. I was at my grandfather's funeral, and we were at the point when he was being lowered into the ground. My cousin's child, 3-4, was running around being an idiot when he ran straight for the giant rectangular hole. He slipped, but his dad grabbed his shirt just in time. Our dad reflexes. Great-grandma skipped her funeral. She was living in California when she died and the rest of us were along the East Coast. The day of her funeral we gathered at my uncle's house in New Jersey for the 3-hour drive to the cemetery. Before we set off, my mother called the funeral home to make sure they had her ashes. They thought we had the ashes. Much frantic phone tag later we discovered there had recently been an influenza outbreak in California. The crematorium is on back order. Great-grandma is still in one piece and will be fashionably 2-3 weeks late. My family was quite upset, and we ended up having an impromptu memorial in my uncle's living room. The more we reminisced about her, the more clear it is exactly something she would do. Not a disaster, but at my step-grandfather's funeral I forgot to silence my phone and Dr. Roxo, the rock and roll clown, decided to announce my new text message by yelling "I do see" during the eulogy. KKKKYEAAH. I wasn't a witness. My wife's grandmother once tried to push another old lady into the grave. She had to be pulled back just as she tried it and physically restrained. Not a disaster, but at my dad's visitation, an adult third cousin or something was running around being like, "I don't even know WHO's funeral it is," and 17-year-old me loudly proclaimed that my dad was in the box, to which he said that I should probably calm down. Like, surprised you didn't rearrange her nose to her forehead. So, my aunt has a really bad tendency to laugh in uncomfortable situations. About 10 minutes into a funeral for a family friend, she starts giggling. I was about 10 years old, so I started giggling because she was. Next thing you know, a large swath of my family is walking out of the funeral while laughing our heads off. Not our best moment. My grandmother's. The priest kept getting her name wrong even after my uncle had gone up to correct him in the middle of the service. Priest then took the opportunity to rail against gay marriage and abortion later on. We were not impressed. When my dad died, the funeral home's power blew out between visitations. We had one in the afternoon from 2 to 4 and another planned from 6 to 8 that evening. About 3:30 the power blew out and the power company said it was going to be a while before they could get his fixed. The funeral home guys were awesome though and got on the phone right away and talked to the big church just down the road who still had power, and they got permission to have the evening visitation there. So they loaded dad up and took off down the road with him and all the flowers and such, and had it all set up and looking nice by the time 6 o'clock rolled around. One of the guys just stayed back at the funeral home and told people as they drove in where the visitation was, and everything went pretty well after that. I just joked about it, saying it would not be family funeral if something had not gone at least a little sideways. That funeral home deserves a 5-star Yelp review. During the funeral procession done on foot, the priest took a moment for himself to take a pee on the side of the road. This was at my great uncle's funeral. His kids thought it was hilarious. I work in a social club. I saw a woman, aged maybe early 30s, standing at the end of a table where her family were seated, at her dad's funeral. She was sobbing her freaking heart out, saying how her dad had molested her as a child. She was drunk, and angry, and damaged. Her siblings, her mother, aunts, uncles, all seated at that table, silent. None of them looked at her. Every one of those bastards knew what he did. When my Bill died, the megachurch his parents attended had to show off their tech-savvy Jesusness by playing YouTube videos instead of, oh who knows, using musical instruments to play the songs. Solemn words about Bill being embraced by Jesus' loving arms, followed by a trailer for Deadpool and the frantic shaking of a mouse because faceless preacher can't turn it off in time or skip to the music video. I'm not sorry that I snort laughed. Bill would have snort laughed with me. Oh man, what a train wreck. That's funny. My friend's dad died. When I started going down the line to console the family, I had a mega brain fart and said congratulations to the first few people in line. Oh my god, this one is the best. Pure positive intent but just no brain. My mother's cousin died and her husband was thought to be a child molester, but nothing had been confirmed. I just remember the police being everywhere. My parents also told me not to go near him, especially in the bathroom. He ended up being arrested for assaulting my uncle during the viewing. This guy used to call my grandmother and threaten her life regularly, so I didn't like him. He is still alive. I have not seen him since, but I would not mind sucker punching him. Maybe not a total disaster, but it's still a moment that I cringe over. I was at the wake of a family friend who had died of natural causes at an advanced age. The idea was that the funeral would be formal, religious, but the wake was to be very informal. Basically it was open mic night. We were at a venue with a stage and a mic, and anyone was welcome to take the spotlight and share a memory or thought about the departed. No schedule, no need to get permission. So after a few touching but overall normal stories, the grandson of the deceased takes the stage. This guy is in his 40s. Big, burly and tattooed, but he is blubbering over his grandma as he struggles to tell his anecdotes. It's sweet and very honest, and lasts for like half an hour. Then he starts talking about how his grandma loved nature and her favorite color was blue, which is why it couldn't be a coincidence that on the very day she died in hospital, a vibrant blue butterfly flew into his room via an open window while he was having breakfast. It was grandma, he proclaimed, her soul now free from her body, coming to give him one last goodbye before he got the news officially. Now I don't know if she had a problem with the guy personally, or was an adamant skeptic, or was just tired of this guy hogging the stage. But at this point in the story, while Buff Mictits is tearing up, some old aunt or other yells out at him, "She died in the evening. She would have still been alive when you had breakfast." This guy looked totally crushed. Not only had he lost his grandma, but he'd also had his belief system called out on the most public and humiliating way possible. He mumbled something about the possibility of the butterfly being a guardian angel and quickly left the stage. I still cringe hard thinking about this, and I barely know the guy. My wife's cousin's funeral. This was tragic. She was a beautiful girl, 17, and had a lot of problems. Her father and father's family had disowned her to the point where her grandmother would abandon a shopping cart and leave the store if she saw her and her sisters. The mother insisted school failed her, so she homeschooled the three older ones and they raised the 4 younger siblings by another father. So the older girls were uneducated and antisocial. When any guy showed any interest, those girls would run off and do anything with them. Rachel attempts suicide several times and was shipped to her grandparents, who do a pretty good job for a few months. She attends school, and then her father tried to get into her life and she ran away. Eventually she gets back to her mom's home. Mom buys her a gun and fricks her boyfriend. Grandmother takes over the funeral arrangements. The extended family comes together to help, including my wife. Rachel's mother puts out her hand for cash like Mona Lisa on Park and Rec, and then would disappear with Rachel's boyfriend, and come back drunk and stoned. She shook my wife down for cash and we ended up buying the boyfriend a cheap suit and shoes to attend the funeral in. There was just no freaking way to even approach discussing the departed and coming out with a positive. You could not say a dang thing because everyone who failed her was right there. The only words possible were to package everything up as her demons and put all the blame on her. The hasty arranged funeral was about as emotionally draining as can be. Rachel's cousin sang and played guitar and were able to share some memories. They did an incredible job under the circumstances, but when they would break down, the whole place would about lose it. The worst point is where the grandmother who disowned her came up to do a reading. She chose Khalil Gibran's The Prophet. I don't know why she thought it was appropriate. She was also blind. She had a magnifying glass and read like a first grader. That reading took forever. It was actually became a relief because we were able to hate her and feel something different than crushing sadness. Next, the casket was closed and the point where brewing fights started. The relatives that ponies up insisted the casket they paid for remain clean. Her sisters and cousins who knew her wanted to send her off with a sticker covered coffin. The compromise was to keep it clean until the funeral is over. Now people are reneging on allowing that to happen. A week, and actually decades of resentment and tension boil over. Voices are raised, there are arguments, and shoving as most of the mourners file out the front. There was over an hour wait for the funeral procession to leave. I don't know the details, but there was some ripped clothes. Rachel's father had scratches on his face, and the coffin was covered in stickers. That is truly super sad. Some people really do just get dealt crap hands. Someone brought their baby to the funeral of a baby, and throughout the entire thing, while everyone was crying over this tiny little coffin, the baby in the back was crying. It was horrifying and the mother was a mess. Everyone wanted to go to the back and punch the parents of the baby in the throat. I just posted something about a funeral on another asked for lost. Well, in 2009 when my great grandma died, a huge physical fight broke out because everyone assumed we stole her money when there was no money in the first place. I was only 6 or 7, so I didn't understand it at the time. I remember being dragged out with tears in my eyes thinking about how stupid they were for fighting at such an event, especially when it was somebody who was like my best friend. I'm sorry, my uncle is already fighting us about all the money we're spending of his mother's. GMA has lived with me for 4 years. We lived 2 miles from her growing up. I can count on one hand the times I saw that man. GMA has no money, but my kids know their GMA, and I feel sorry for his kids, because they are missing out on one hell of a lady. I really want to talk about how it's confirmation season, and earlier this week I attended one where in the middle of the ceremony the children are asked if they denounce Satan and respond in unison, I do. And right then a girl fainted before she could commit to God. She has accepted Satan into her heart. Nice. An undertaker fell in my great-grand's grave. She would have literally peed herself laughing, so it wasn't too awful for us. A lot of folks seem to have had similar occurrences. It was a funeral for my grandfather and a relative decided to make the whole service about religion. Finding it, embracing it, knowing it, loving it. He had become a Latter-day Saint mere months before this happened, and the whole funeral felt more like a recruiting event. Tacky, to say the least. Ugh. Freaking Mormons. Not really a disaster, but I will contribute. At my Grammy's funeral we each got a flower to place on her coffin before it was lowered into the ground. The night before there had been a lot of rain, so the hole had a good foot of water in it. My nephew stepped up to place his flower and it slipped off the coffin's rounded top with a loud splash, breaking the dead silence. The two of us got laughing right hard, but nobody else thought it was funny. Hey, ex-cemetery saleswoman here. One of my colleagues was working a funeral where the grave hadn't been dug by the time the family got there. It was for a child, and the couple was in their late teens, early 20s. It was pouring down rain, and my co-worker was standing outside with the parents while the backhoe dug out the grave. A pretty unpleasant sight. You can see the vaults in the adjacent graves, and sometimes they get nicked by the backhoe. It's also creepy to see how they're stacked on top of each other, since we dig them too deep. Capital A. Apparently it wasn't dug because either the family hadn't yet paid. My boss. Cemeteries are cash only business. We don't dig the grave until we get paid. $3,500. So they were scrambling to find the money. Once again, the parents were pretty much kids. So that burial ended up being 2 hours late, while we had 4 other funerals going on at the same time. The place was beyond a madhouse. When my great-grandfather died, his army colleagues from World War II saw it as their duty to carry his coffin from the church to the cemetery. The thing is that this is not really a tradition in my country, and normally they simply drive it with a car over to the grave. Distance between church and cemetery is about 500 meters. Well, my great-grandfather was extremely obese the time he died, and his comrades were almost unable to walk on their own, but still they insisted. It lasted about 50 meters until the first one of them broke down because it was too heavy for him, and the coffin crashed on the ground, almost cracking this goddamn thing. We had to call the ambulance for this poor guy. It was absolutely weird. I got the giggles at my mother's funeral 15 years ago. You see, it's kind of a family cemetery, and apparently mom chose a plot right on the edge of the ravine. Literally 4.5 feet away from the ravine. Well, mom had always wanted to go on a cruise, and all I could think about was one good gully washer, rainstorm, and she gets to finally go on that cruise. I whispered it to my cousins and we all started cracking up during the service. I finally had to interrupt the service to explain why we were laughing. This was after I was 1.5 hours late for the funeral because my plumbing backed up in my house. Crap everywhere in the bathroom, had to find a babysitter for the plumber, and got a speeding ticket driving the 200 miles to the funeral. Then to get the giggles just kind of set the day. Certainly made an impression. I play in a brass quartet and we were paid to play at someone's funeral. Mass was quiet as usual, and afterwards we waited at the grave for the ceremony. After she was lowered, someone asked if he could say some words. She started with, "My mother wasn't a nice woman," and that was the nicest thing she said of her. She accused her of several terrible things and badmouthed the rest of the family. Several people started to cry. Some fled the scene and there was lots of shouting. All of this next to the open grave. All we could do was to start playing as loud as possible. Never thought something like that happens outside of soaps. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.